Gardens is actually the senior lecturer at the University of Central Florida. He's written 9 books on Florida history. This is his most recent installation, and he has a doctorate from the University of Florida. Please join me in welcoming James C. Clark.
I first noticed this in kindergarten, and it's true today, decades and decades later, when I teach at UCF, and it's probably the only thing in the world that has not changed over the decades, and that is that the A students sit in the front row and the troublemakers sit in the back. I'm going to just kind of take you on a journey and talk about, for the most part, Florida as it was. It's hard to imagine how Florida developed. We start with the Spanish in St. Augustine. Medicine was very rudimentary, and doctors generally didn't know what they were doing, and so there was a disease called consumption, which was basically tuberculosis, but also anything doctors couldn't figure out. And so in the early 1800s, they began sending people to Florida. The only town really is St. Augustine, and in fact, as you can probably figure out, Florida is the worst place to send someone. You want to send them to Arizona, to a dry climate, not to a wet, humid climate. And it's funny, several people came down, and there was one who was a leader in the effort to bring people down here, a doctor, and he wrote that this had the cure for everything, and to come to St. Augustine, and he didn't mention that he had come down here when his wife was sick, and she died. So it worked really well. While we're on the subject of St. Augustine, you all are fairly close, and some of you get up there. I wanted to just tell you about, everybody goes to the big fort, and the big fort. I have 2 other places that I love in St. Augustine, and I would encourage you, next time you're up there, to go. This is a fort. Has anybody ever seen this fort?
Yeah.
Some of you have been there. Isn't this neater than the big fort? This is Fort Matanzas, which is south of St. Augustine, built by the Spanish as a watch fort, in case the British were coming up the inlet there. And it is a national park, and it's on an island, and so they take you over in a little boat, and you get to climb up in it. And it's really neat. So next time you're there, it's on St. Augustine, on the land side of St. Augustine Beach. The people who've been to St. Augustine, has anybody been to the Presbyterian Church? This is thought to be the most expensive building ever built in the United States, in real dollars. Henry Flagler, remember, this was built for a town of 5,000 people, fishing village at the time. Henry Flagler built it in memory of his wife and daughter. His wife had died of various diseases, and his daughter died in childbirth. And so he spent unlimited money building this magnificent church. So next time you're up there, it's right behind the college. Across the street is the Methodist Church. And the Methodists wrote to Flagler, and they said, "Hey, you're building this big church for the Presbyterians, what about us?" And Flagler said, all right, I'll build you a church. And his building supervisor was used to building the most magnificent and most expensive buildings, the Ponce de Leon Hotel, this church. And so he began building this, and Flagler started getting the bills, and he wrote back to the supervisor telling him to cut expenses and saying, these are only Methodists. The St. Augustine attractions tended to be kind of collections of stuff that people had. And a dentist, or he said he was a dentist, had a museum in the 1800s. Some of you have been to the Leitner Museum in St. Augustine, which, as you know, is a collection of the weirdest stuff you've ever seen, and without much sense to it. And so the early days are sick people, and then the springs. People begin coming for the springs, which are mostly in kind of Ocala to the north, and it is extremely popular. Hotels are built around the springs. Wealthy people come down. The waters are supposed to cure you, to make you better. Green Cove Springs up near Jacksonville is probably the leading spring, although there are dozens of competitors. So for the first, 50 years or so, our target audience is sick people, basically. This is a flyer for the Plant Railroad, which also springs up after the Civil War. Plant had made a fortune during the Civil War, one of the few people to make a fortune. He had worked for an express company, a national express company, very much like FedEx today, except with railroads. And before the Civil War, they transferred him to Atlanta. And when the Civil War came, the company broke in two, and here's this guy who ended up with half the company, and he was charged with transporting stuff for the Confederacy, and he made a fortune. And after the war, many of the railroads were bankrupt, torn up, and he began buying them and putting them together, as did Henry Flagler. Plant was on the West Coast. Flagler, of course, was on the East Coast. And this is his list of attractions along the coast. What is kind of surprising to me, it's Plant who invents the package vacation. You would pay one fare, and it would include your rail transportation, your hotels, your meals, everything, all in one place. There's the thing again. This is Dixieland, which is the first amusement park in Florida. It's located in Jacksonville on an island, and it opens around 1900 and immediately becomes tremendously successful. They would have John Philip Sousa would come with his band, Annie Oakley would give gun demonstrations, all of these things going on there. And really the first, with carousels and all kinds of things. Also in Jacksonville, I love this. I don't know how you would do this. Downtown Jacksonville, the attraction was the Bears. And as you can see, one is trained to climb the pole, and the other has a stick that he plays with. And so people, as you can see, would gather, and this was considered entertainment. And people would pay to see these talented bears all around 1900. This is where Harriet Beecher Stowe is. She's sitting on the porch. So the plantation goes bankrupt, or she unloads it, and she has tremendous amounts of money from Uncle Tom's Cabin, which not only was a book, but a play and everything else. So she now buys a house on the St. Johns River south of Jacksonville and works a deal with the steamboat companies that she would come out every day when their steamboats came by. And she would wave to them, and she became an attraction. The great writer Harriet Beecher Stowe, and eventually they built a dock there, and the boats would dock, and she would come down and say hi to people. And if the steamship paid her, she would come out. If the steamship didn't pay her, she would not come out. But she begins writing newspaper columns about the wonders of Florida, and urging people to buy land in Florida. And these columns are reprinted all over the north, and they begin a new kind of tourism and a new kind of land buying in Florida. I love this. I just threw it in here. I take it nobody's been to the atomic tunnel. Have you?
No.
You went to the atomic tunnel?
I was very young.
Really? That's amazing. Wow.
He did it mainly to sell his orchids. So
Yeah, this guy dug this tunnel, and there were glass panes in the top. And you would walk through the tunnel, and each pane had an orchid in it. And you would pick out an orchid you wanted to buy. You paid to go through the tunnel, but the real goal was to sell you orchids. And then there was a walking catfish who would walk across the tunnel into a body of water and then walk back. And as you can imagine, people do not come to Florida to go underground in a tunnel. And so in the 50s, they changed the name to the atomic tunnel, as if it had something to do with the atom bomb. And you were going to be safe in the atomic tunnel. Anyway, I just, the things people come up with. Pardon? Well, no, it was, but it only, it was a catfish that walked. There are those, yeah. But this is one of the steamboats coming down the St. John's. It's a terrible picture, and the reason I show it, even though it's terrible, is because the guy in the front is Ulysses S. Grant.
Oh, wow.
Grant came down to St. John's and went to Sanford, stopped in Sanford, went to Silver Springs in the 1880s. He was trying to run for a third term for president, and he came down to Florida to do some campaigning. This is the river line, Jacksonville, Palatka, Sanford, Enterprise. It's hard to imagine today. Has anybody been to Enterprise? It's not much today, but at one time it was one of the 10 largest cities in Florida, major port on the St. John's, and you can see that you can travel between Jacksonville and Sanford for $3.75. Sanford becomes a major port, and that's why the railroad is there today. The auto train is there today because it becomes a major rail hub there. This is Silver Springs, and I apologize because I am not sure who is who, but one of the people in this picture is Esther Williams, the actor and actress. And Silver Springs, one of the early and most successful springs, was used for movies. Some of you remember Creature from the Black Lagoon. That was filmed in Silver Springs, and also another springs up north. Silver Springs becomes the leading tourist attraction, and we still do this today. Disney opened, and then 20 other attractions open around it. And so when Silver Springs became commercial and started the glass bottom boats in the 1880s, other attractions, there was a religious attraction, there was animals, there were snake attractions, all kinds of things. So you could almost spend your vacation there. This is a group of athletes from the north, and they're African American. There were two parks. One was called Silver Springs, we've all heard of. The other was on the other side of the spring called Paradise Park. And it was for African Americans during the Jim Crow era. And it finally closed around 1960. But it thrived and was rated as the best attraction for African Americans in the South. So, the other thing that's going on are ostriches. We love ostriches. A guy buys a bunch of ostriches and ships them to California for an attraction. And ostriches mate a lot. They're like rabbits, apparently. And so he ended up with a lot of ostriches. And so he shipped a bunch back here. And ostrich farms were extremely popular, both in St. Augustine, Jacksonville. This one is in Miami. You can ride an ostrich. You can put a saddle on an ostrich and ride it, and they would have races, just like a horse. They would have jockeys, and they'd have colors on the saddles, you know, and so you can do that. You can you know, try to pet them and feed them. They're ornery animals, and God knows, you know, people were bitten, but they become a huge attraction in Florida. This is one of the early combination gas stations, rest stops, and attractions. People would have a little fruit stand, and sometimes it was their house along the highway. And they would want the cars to stop, so they'd put up a sign, live alligator, or something else. And you know, if you're from the north and you've never seen an alligator, hey, this is pretty neat. And so people would stop, and the admission was always free, but you know, try to get out of that place when you have kids with you without spending any money. So this becomes a model. There are going to be hundreds and hundreds of these all over Florida. There's not a lot of investment, and so they become kind of the early standard as the government builds highways. I like this because it's a house in St. Petersburg. How would you like it if your next door neighbor opened an alligator farm? And so somebody took their house and converted it into a alligator farm and zoo, and it worked. And it was extremely successful for years. This is the Fountain of Youth. I don't know if anybody's been to the Fountain of Youth. You know, I'm going to tell you this story, and I kind of doubt it, but I don't know, it works so well. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of a poet named Robert Service. Has anybody ever heard of Robert Service? Have you? He wrote all those Alaska poems, Dangerous Dan McGrew, and Barroom Fights, and things like that. And one of his poems is about a barroom fight. And the guy is killed, and he's laying on the barroom floor dead. And Service wrote about real things in poetry, and he says, you know, as he lay on the barroom floor, the woman who pinched his poke, who stole his gold, was the woman who's known as Lou. Okay? So. That part's true, but I don't know if it's connected to the Lou who shows up in St. Augustine a couple of years later, moving from Alaska, and has a bunch of gold with her. You know? It sounds almost too good. And she says she's going to Spain to do research. And she comes back, and she goes to this land she had bought, and miraculously discovers this cross, this giant cross with 15 stones going this way and 13 stones going this way. Hey, 15, 13. Ponce de Leon must have put this here when he landed, and of course that would mean he anticipated the change in the calendar, which was later. But she also had some artifacts and some old papers, and she said that this is where Ponce de Leon landed, and this was the Fountain of Youth, and it was hugely successful. So successful that there were about a dozen fountains of youth. All of those. The irony is, she made a fortune, and the irony is that, and of course it's just a fraud. But then, I think what, the 1970s was it, that some archaeologists were digging and found it had true historic significance. And it's one of the first settlements, one of the first Indian mounds, and it's one of the most important archaeology sites. And so half of it's a fraud, and the other half is serious. So it's kind of a weird attraction in Florida. This is the alligator and ostrich farm. Again, the one in St. Augustine started out with ostriches. And has anybody been to the alligator farm? And yeah, everybody. It's one of the oldest. It is thought to be the oldest running attraction in Florida. What is really weird is it's on the highway, and it moved there like 100 years ago. Their original location, you can see, maybe you can't anymore, the environment is changing, but from a pipe sticking up in the Atlantic Ocean. The soil, the dirt used to go out into the Atlantic Ocean. They start when a couple of workmen are working on a project out there, and they would get there in the morning, and there was an old shack there, and there were alligators. And so every morning, these guys would grab the alligators and throw them in this old shack so they wouldn't be eaten. And then at night, when they were going home, they let the alligators out. And this was a routine. And so they had these alligators in the shed, and one day, some wealthy people from St. Augustine who were staying at the Flagler Hotel were coming by, and they stopped their carriage and asked some questions, and they found the alligators were in the little shed there, and the guy said, "Can we see the alligators?" And the workman said, no, you can't go out there. And the guy said, "Well, we'll give you a quarter." And so the first alligator farm was born. This is the cover of Liberty Magazine. Liberty Magazine, at one time the largest circulation magazine in the country, and kind of a Life or Look, one of those kind of magazines. Tremendously successful until they said that Alf Landon would win the election in 1936 and that Franklin Roosevelt would lose. And after that it was downhill. This is a picture of what becomes known as the tin can tourists. The highways, I'll show you a highway picture in a minute. The federal government around World War I begins to realize they're going to have to get involved in highway construction. First of all, the states can't afford it, but more than that, there has to be some overall plan. You can't have Florida building a highway from Miami to Jacksonville and it stops there, and then Georgia builds a highway from Atlanta to Tallahassee, and nothing in between. So the government gets involved, and now this opens it up to everybody with a car. Before, you had to do the railroads, and it costs a lot of money. And the hotels, like the Flagler hotels, were aimed at wealthy people. And so now these people begin coming in their old jalopies. As you know, they used to call the old Fords Tin Lizzies, and a lot of people think that's how they got the name Tin Can Tourist. There are other variations of that, but they would come. Some had converted their cars. They would sleep in their cars. They would eat in their cars, and they were not particularly popular. The saying in Florida was that they came with one shirt and one $20 bill and did not change either one of them. Many of you have traveled this road. US 1. It looks a little different today. I think there's a Wawa there, you can see. That's it. That was the early US 1 along the coast of Florida, barely 2 lanes in the 1920s. This is one of the roads the federal government was involved in building. So this is the Tin Can Tourist Camp in Gainesville. This is where you would camp. These are camps. You can see cars have kind of been converted into vans where you can sleep and things like that. Every year, thousands and tens of thousands of these folks would come to Florida, usually staying for the season. The season was December to March back then. Here's one from the 1950s. Again, all you needed was a few snakes and a couple of alligators, and you stopped for gas and ended up spending a small fortune. Did anybody ever stop in your youth at one of these places? Did you? Really? And you'd stop at these places? Anybody else ever? Yeah, these were hugely popular, and they were everywhere. This is in Miami, and one of the brighter moves, of course, over the years in Florida, people have decided to fill in the Everglades without realizing it's where we get our water from the recharge. And so the Seminoles were kind of being forced out of their land in the Everglades for hunting. It wasn't good anymore. And one of the things they were good at was wrestling alligators. And because they were around them all the time in the Everglades. And so people began to open attractions like this one with a real Indian village and alligator wrestling. And so, thanks to the Indians, alligator wrestling becomes very popular. I don't know, by the way, I love this story. Years ago, they were building a skyscraper in Tampa, and they were digging the foundation, and they came across bones. And immediately, hey, you can't stop, can't dig. And they found it had been an Indian burial ground. And the Indians said, oh, sorry, can't build your skyscraper here. And of course the developer, yeah, we're gonna build. And so they went back and forth, and finally the developer said, tell you what, you let us have this land, and we'll give you other land. And the Indians said, we've heard that before. And so they said, no, we'll get the state to, authorize it, make it, clearly your land. And so they got the land, and they moved the bones to the new land. Has anybody been to the sacred Indian grounds in Tampa? Nobody's been there. It's a moving experience. I was moved out of $120. It's better known as the Hard Rock Casino. The Indians said, okay, thank you for the land, and built a casino. This is the original Marineland. It was formed as a movie studio. Some wealthy people got together, and the idea was they were going to make movies there. And so everything was set up not necessarily for an attraction, but to make movies, especially with underwater scenes and things like that. And gradually they began to attract tourists, and today it's been through about a half a dozen ownership changes. Has anybody been there in the last
Yeah.
Have you been there recently? How is it? Is it
Not too exciting.
really?
Dingy.
That's so sad. I mean, it used to be so great. And this is Wiki Watching. Anybody been to Wiki Watching? If you haven't been to Wiki Watching, you got to go to Wiki Watching. This is one of the mermaids. After World War II, a Navy diver, a veteran from the war, had used a tank on his back to breathe underwater, and he invented an air hose that would force air, like a pump, that would force air through it so you could stay underwater for tremendous amounts of time. He opened his attraction, and it proved unbelievably attractive to people. They would come from all over the country, and they would stay for days and come back. And there were different shows. The women would eat underwater. They would, just do dances underwater, and it became one of the biggest attractions in Florida. And this is one. Who's been to Cypress Gardens? Anybody? Wow, wow. A man named Dick Pope is an advertising executive in Chicago, and he was from Winter Haven, and he came home in the late 1920s and went into the real estate business just as the crash was coming. And he needed a job. Nobody was buying land. And so he became a promoter for motorboat companies, Johnson Outboards, all these companies. And then his wife read a story about Middleton Gardens in South Carolina, where they had opened up their plantation as a gardens and made, I think it was $36,000 the first year or something. And so she got the idea for a garden. They acquired land, which, as you can imagine, at the time was very cheap, and they began offering beautiful flowers. They added beautiful women in period costumes, the big belle of the ball kinds of costumes. And when World War II came, because of gas rationing, they were worried that they were going to go out of business. And so one day, a busload of soldiers came down from Orlando on a weekend pass. They were looking for something to do. And it just so happened that some people were water skiing on the lake. And these guys were from the north. They had never seen water skiing. And they were fascinated. And they watched these people water ski, thinking it was part of the show. And it was just a coincidence. And so the next weekend, some other soldiers came and said, "Hey, what time is the water skiing?" And we don't have water skiing. And so they quickly added the water skiing. And that's how it started. It was a fluke. No one had ever planned that. Strangely, Dick Pope became the king of tourism in Florida as late as the 1960s, early 60s. His attraction, the Cypress Gardens and the Grand Canyon, were rated as the top 2 attractions in the country. It was hugely profitable, and he was friends with Disney. He and Walt Disney and Roy Disney, Walt's brother, were close personal friends. And and so he gave Walt lots of advice, and of course it was Walt who put Dick Pope out of business. All these attractions, and we'll see some of them later, but the static ones, wax museums and things like that, simply could not compete. This is one of the western towns. As you remember, in the late 50s, early 60s, every TV show was a western, and it led developers to open western-themed places. Dodge City was one of them. There was one endorsed by the Cartwright family up in the Panhandle. And so they spread everywhere. This is one in Ocala, and it was extremely popular and did land office business until Disney came along. And again, simply could not compete with Disney. And again, here's another one, a wax museum, and you know, they would try to jazz it up and make it look like they were talking and things like that. And but they just could not compete. There was one in Orlando called Stars Hall of Fame that originally was drawing like 1 million, 2 million tourists a year. And then as Disney got up and running, it failed. This is a place, had several names. It started out as Circus World in Haines City. This was one of the ones that was going to make their fortune on the overflow. Everybody had this overflow theory. Remember, when Disney first opened, it was just the Magic Kingdom. So, hey, and it sounds like a good theory. You're coming down here for a week of vacation. You're going to spend 1, maybe 2 days at the Magic Kingdom, and you have 5 days left. So we'll build an attraction and take one of those days. And so dozens of people began planning these things. Most of them never happened. Hurricane World, Bible World, Roy Rogers World, and some of them did happen. This is one of them, which started out as the winter home for Ringling Brothers, and they've had these big plans, and it just faded after Walt got going. And then Walt, well, he was dead, but his family opened a second one. They opened Epcot. Well, now you're spending 4 days, and pretty soon you were a captive on their property, and there was no extra time in your week. It became another attraction called Boardwalk and Baseball, which yeah, remember, which also failed. And one day they, I'm sorry, they closed in the middle of the day, and there were people on the ride, and they just literally pulled the plug, and there were people, you know, on the Ferris wheel, and all this, and they said, "Everybody leave," and that was the end of Boardwalk and Baseball. And now, if you ever go there, where Highway 27 intersects the I-4, it's all been torn down. It's now a huge shopping center, and Universal Studios comes to Florida. Universal is strange, and I don't understand their business model. And I've read about it, and I interviewed some people about it. But unlike Disney, which makes a decision, hey, we're going to make a movie about this, Universal is much more fraternal or something, where Steven Spielberg comes to Universal and says, hey, I want to make a movie about this. And they become kind of partners in the movie. And so Universal planned to open an attraction when Disney did and could not get their act together. You know, Spielberg, oh wait, I want this, and you know, I want the Jaws ride to be here, and other people, because they had to deal with all these people. They couldn't make just, hey, well, here's what we're doing. And so by the time they got going, most of the land had been sold, and so they ended up kind of on a cramped piece of property. Some of you have been to Universal, and from the rides that are high, you can see all the surrounding area, and that is, wait, yes. Yep, that is it. Don't call. I do want to tell you about Disney coming, because I think it's a fascinating story. And many of you, of course, remember this date well. They are, from the moment Disneyland opened in California, they begin plotting an East Coast location. They did a survey. Only 2% of the people who went to Disneyland came from east of the Mississippi. So they start looking for places, and they looked at Niagara Falls, and that's not going to work. They looked outside New York, outside Washington, D.C. They looked at St. Louis, which had a strange benefit. Walt Disney met with Augie Busch, the chairman of Anheuser-Busch Beer Company, and talked to him about his plans. And Augie Busch thought, well, this is kind of neat. This sounds like something I'd like to get involved in. And so after Walt left, he decided not to build in St. Louis, but Augie Busch turned his brewery in Tampa into Busch Gardens and then opened other locations simply from that conversation with Walt. They finally decide to open it in Florida, and they narrow it down to 4 sites. One is Ocala, and Disney, people don't understand, Disney was extremely familiar with this area. His family had lived in Lake County, northern Lake County. There's still Disney family members there. I'm stupid. I spoke there several years ago, and I mentioned that there were still Disney relatives here in northern Lake County, and I said, God, wouldn't that be tough? You know, half the family are billionaires, and the other half are fishing, you know? And I said, God, how would you like to be one of the have-not Disneys? And at the end of the talk, this guy came up to me and said, hello, I'm Kevin Disney, one of the have-nots. So anyway, Walt had come here summers to stay with his cousins. Lake County becomes a county in 1887 and splits off from Orange. Volusia was part of Orange County at one time. And it is so lightly populated that it is 9 months before they issue their first marriage license. 9 months. Here it gets weirder. The first marriage license is issued to Walt Disney's parents, who were married right here in Lake County. And they move, of course, out of the state. But both of his grandparents lived here. And so because of that, there's no I-4 or anything. And so back then it was, this is 44, 46 is the one to Daytona, right?
Yeah.
Ocala, yeah, I get them
It's
confused.
the one out now.
Yeah, and so they lived along 46. So he had been to Daytona and Ocala, and the other site they look at is Orlando. They also look here at Daytona, and they look at Bradenton on the west coast. They dropped Daytona and Bradenton because Walt says, I don't want to compete with a free attraction, the beach. He doesn't want people saying, hey, should we spend $100 to go to Disney or go lay on the beach for free? And so he narrows it down. He flies into Tampa secretly, borrows a plane from Arthur Godfrey, so there'll be no connection. And the next day he drives up to Ocala and looks at land there. The original plan had been to drive over to Orlando, but he finds he has to get back to California for a business meeting. So he is going to fly over Orlando instead of driving and seeing the land. And he flies over, and where the turnpike meets I-4, he says, that's it. Certainly a historic moment.
Yeah.
Historic moment. Do you remember what you were doing at that moment?
Did you say what year?
Do you? What were you doing?
56.
Driving a submarine on the Atlantic Ocean.
Ah, at that moment? You remember what you were doing? You sure? Can we trust him? You think he's telling the truth? You think he's telling the truth?
Yep.
You sure? All right. We'll see if he's being honest. So he says that's it. The plane banks. at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and heads back to California. They stop in New Orleans to refuel. Walt steps off the plane to stretch his legs. A member of the ground crew comes up and says, "Mr. Disney, did you hear that at 1 o'clock this afternoon, President Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas?" Yeah. And so, one more quick Disney story, if I might, because this is my favorite story. Had Walt driven over to Orlando, and I'm not alone in this, I believe that Disney World would be in Ocala today, because the land he pointed was underwater, and he couldn't see that from the air. And so, of course, once he said that's it, that was it. And so the early people got there, and it was a swamp. In fact, it took an extra year to open because they had to fill in dirt. I don't know, some of you heard stories about how there's an underground Disney, and it's not underground. It's at ground level. Disney is 16 feet of fill dirt because it was so swampy. And so when they first went out there, they had to get these boats, these flat-bottom boats, and with sticks, and they would push them through the swamp, the early surveyors and everybody like that. And they had to take everything with them. They took food and water. They were going to the jungle. There was nothing around there. And they took toilet paper, and they wore pith helmets. You know, it was like going to a jungle, as I say. So one day they're out in the middle of the jungle, and they are surveying, and they go to this area, and there's a chicken farm there, in the middle of nowhere, and there's a little diner, and it has cold drinks, and it has a bathroom and hot food. This is the greatest discovery they've ever made. And so they start going there, 3 times a day. It is the greatest thing. And an executive flies in from California, and he starts packing up all the stuff to go out in the swamp. And they say, no, you don't need to do that anymore. We found this chicken farm. And so they go out, and the executive goes to the chicken farm. And after they have lunch, he says, maybe we ought to tell the guy we want to buy his property. Sounds good, yeah. And he says, and fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, one of the other Disney people said, oh, hold on a second here. We buy his property, he's going to leave, and we'll lose a diner. So they said, all right, we're going to wait till the very end. So they wait till the very end, and they go to the guy and they say, hey, we'd like to buy your property. And the man starts crying. And he says, I have gotten down on my knees every night and prayed that someone would buy my land. He said, I don't have a family. I'm out here by myself. It is so lonely. But lately business has been so good. If you ever go to where Lake Buena Vista is, there's a Grand Hyatt Hotel right there. That is the chicken farm. It is one of 2 pieces of property Disney did not get out of the 27,000 acres. Thank you very much.